My name is Ibrahim Traoré. I am the president of Burkina Faso. I speak to you not as a man seeking attention, but as a man who has faced a moment where everything could have been lost in a single decision. On the morning of March 10th, 2026 at exactly 6:40, I woke up expecting a routine day. The sun had not yet risen fully over Ouagadougou, and the air carried that quiet stillness that comes before a nation begins to move. But within minutes, that stillness was broken. A message arrived. Not a normal report, not a political update. It was marked with the highest level of urgency our system allows, the kind of message that does not come unless something has already gone wrong or is about to. I remember holding that document in my hands. I did not rush. I have learned that when something is urgent, rushing only clouds the mind, so I read it slowly. And as the message was decoded line by line, I felt something shift inside me. This was not a warning. It was a declaration. The source had been confirmed with near certainty. The region identified was one we all knew carried danger. The patterns matched those of a group that does not negotiate lightly and does not threaten without intent. But what I read next was something I had never faced before. This was not about land, it was not about resources, it was not even about power in the way leaders usually understand it. It was about faith. The message made it clear that I was not being asked to adjust a policy or change a position. I was being forced into a choice that no leader should ever have to make. I was told that within 48 hours, I must stand before the public and deny my faith in Jesus Christ. Not privately, not quietly, but openly, broadcast across Africa, seen by more than 1 billion people. And if I refused, the consequences were already prepared. There would be a coup. Not a possibility, but a certainty. There were already those inside the system ready to act. Forces outside our borders were positioned to move. Everything had been arranged. It was not a threat. It was a sentence waiting to be carried out. I sat there in silence after reading it. Not because I did not understand, but because I understood too clearly. I have faced danger before. I have seen conflict. I have lived in a world where decisions carry weight. But this was different. Because this was not simply about losing power. It was about losing something far deeper. I realized in that moment that I was not being asked to choose between safety and risk. I was being asked to choose between power and Jesus Christ. And I knew, even before I spoke a single word, that whatever I chose would not only shape my life, it would echo far beyond me. I did not respond immediately. I did not call a press conference. I did not issue a statement. Instead, I remained still. Because when a decision touches the soul, it cannot be made in haste. And what I was facing was not just a political crisis. It was the greatest test of my life. I have faced many difficult messages in my life, but nothing has ever felt as final as that one. There was no room for interpretation, no hidden meaning, no space for negotiation. The words were direct, cold, and complete. I was to stand before the world and deny Jesus Christ. Not in private, where a man might try to explain himself later. Not in a quiet room where the damage could be contained, but in full view of the continent. A public renunciation broadcast across Africa, reaching more than 1 billion souls. They wanted it seen, they wanted it heard, they wanted it remembered. And they gave me 48 hours. Time, in moments like that, does not feel like a gift. It feels like a countdown. Every minute carries weight, every hour presses on the mind. But what made this ultimatum different was not just the demand, it was the certainty behind it. They were not asking, they were informing me. If I refused, the consequences would not unfold slowly. They would begin immediately. A coup had already been prepared. Not imagined, not planned in theory, but set into motion. There were people inside the system ready to act. Men who wore the same uniform, who had sworn the same oath, but who had chosen a different path. And beyond our borders, armed forces were waiting. Not gathering, not hesitating. Waiting. Everything was already in place. In that moment, I understood something that many people never fully grasp. There are times in leadership when events move faster than decisions, when the outcome seems already written. And all that remains is whether you will accept it or stand against it. This was one of those times. I remember looking again at the message, not because I doubted what I had read, but because I needed to be sure there was no mistake. There was none. They had given me a choice that was not truly a choice. Deny Jesus Christ or watch everything fall. Power, stability, order, the things a leader is sworn to protect, the things people depend on without even thinking about them. All of it placed on one side, and on the other side, my faith. Some might think the hardest part was the threat of war, or the idea of betrayal within the army, but that was not what weighed on me the most. What struck me deeply was this. They did not simply want control of a nation. They wanted control of what a man believes. They understood something that many underestimate. If you can force a man to deny his faith publicly, you do not just weaken him. You send a message to millions that faith itself can be broken, that it can be traded, that it can be silenced. And that is far more powerful than any weapon. I sat with my advisors later that morning. The room was tense, but quiet. Everyone understood the gravity of the situation. No one spoke carelessly. We went over the facts again, the intelligence, the confirmed risks, the timing, the possible outcomes. There was no doubt. If I refused, the country would face immediate instability. Lives would be at risk. The structure we had worked to build could fracture in hours. And yet, if I accepted, something else would be lost. Not just for me, but for anyone who still believed that faith is not something you abandon when it becomes inconvenient. I could see it in the eyes of those around me. Some were thinking about the nation, some were thinking about the people, some were thinking about survival. All of them were right to do so. Because leadership is not simple. It is not a story where every answer is clear and every path is clean. Sometimes every option carries a cost. And this was one of those moments. The ultimatum was not just a demand. It was a test, not of strategy, not of intelligence, but of what cannot be measured easily, conviction. I understood then that whatever I chose, there would be consequences that could not be undone. If I gave in, I might preserve order for a time, but I would have sent a message that faith can be bent under pressure. If I refused, I might protect something invisible, but risk everything visible. And so the question became simple, even if the answer was not. What is a man allowed to keep when everything else is taken from him? That was the question I carried with me through those first hours. Not spoken aloud, but impossible to ignore. After the first shock passed, I began to see more clearly what stood behind the ultimatum. At first glance, it looked like a political threat, a calculated move to destabilize a government, to create fear, to force compliance. That is how such messages are often understood. But this was not only political. There was something deeper, something more deliberate. The words they used revealed it. They did not speak about territory. They did not mention economic demands. They did not even try to disguise their intention behind complex language. They spoke directly about Jesus Christ. They said they did not believe in him. They said this faith must be stopped in the Sahel. They said it was dangerous. That word stayed with me. Dangerous. Not weapons, not armies, not governments. Faith. I read those lines more than once, not because I did not understand them, but because I wanted to understand what kind of thinking leads to such a conclusion. And then it became clear. They were not targeting me as a president. They were targeting what I carry inside me. A man can be removed from office. A system can be replaced. A government can fall and rise again. But faith, if it is shaken at its root, the damage spreads quietly and widely. They knew this. That is why the demand was so specific. They did not ask me to step down. They did not ask me to change a law. They did not ask for negotiation. They wanted me to stand before the world and deny Jesus Christ. Because if I did, it would not end with me. It would echo. It would reach villages, cities, families, and individuals. It would plant a question in the minds of people who might already be struggling. If a leader can deny his faith under pressure, what does that mean for everyone else? That was the real objective. Not control of a country, control of a message. And that message was simple. Faith can be broken. I began to see that this was not a battle fought with visible weapons. There were no tanks in the streets at that moment, no gunfire, no explosions. And yet, the impact of what they were attempting could have been just as destructive. Because when belief is turned into something to be ashamed of, something to be hidden, something to be abandoned under pressure, a nation changes from within. Quietly, slowly, and often without realizing it. They wanted to make faith into a liability, to make those who believe feel isolated, to create an environment where standing firm becomes the harder path, not because it is wrong, but because it is costly. And in that kind of environment, people begin to compromise. Not all at once, but little by little, until what was once strong becomes uncertain, and what was once clear becomes blurred. I understood then that this was not just about me making a statement. It was about what that statement would represent. If I stood and denied my faith, it would not simply be my own decision. It would become a symbol, a signal, a message sent across borders, across communities, across generations. And if that message took root, it would change more than politics. It would change the way people see truth, courage, and conviction. That is why they chose this path. Because they understood something many overlook. You do not need to defeat a people physically if you can weaken what they believe. You do not need to conquer land if you can reshape the mind. And you do not need to silence everyone if you can make a few visible figures surrender publicly. The effect multiplies. That realization settled heavily on me, because it meant that whatever decision I made would not remain personal. It would carry weight far beyond my own life. I was no longer just a man facing a threat. I had become a point of pressure in something much larger. And that is when I began to understand the true nature of the situation. This was not simply an attempt to force a political outcome. This was an attempt to redefine what can be demanded from a human soul, and whether that demand can be enforced. I did not speak these thoughts aloud at the time. There are moments when silence is necessary, not because there is nothing to say, but because what is being understood must first settle. I needed to be sure of one thing, not what they wanted, but what I was willing to give. Because once that line is crossed, it cannot be undone. And I knew that if I misunderstood the true target, I might make the wrong decision for the right reasons. But now, I could see it clearly. They were not trying to take my position. They were trying to take something far more difficult to defend, and far more important to keep. My faith. I did not respond to them. Not that day. Not the next morning. There was no public statement. No immediate reaction, no sign of panic. From the outside, it may have looked like control. But inside, there was a storm I had never experienced before. Because the most difficult battles are not always the ones you can see. They are the ones that take place in silence. The ones where no one can step in to help you. No advisor, no general, no ally. Only you, and what you believe. I sat alone that night longer than usual. The room was quiet, but my thoughts were not. I began to walk through every possible outcome. Not as a president, but as a man who understands the weight of consequences. If I chose to comply, the path ahead would become easier, at least on the surface. The threat would likely be removed, the immediate danger would pass, the structure of the state could remain intact. Lives might be spared in the short term. There would be those who would say it was the wise decision, the practical one, the responsible one. But I asked myself a question that would not leave me. At what cost? Because there are decisions that protect the body of a nation, but wound its spirit. And there are decisions that risk everything visible, but preserve something unseen. I could not ignore that. I thought about the people who look to leadership not just for protection, but for direction, not just for stability, but for truth. What would they see if I stood before them and denied what I believe? What would that teach? That faith is conditional, that it stands only when it is safe, that it can be set aside when pressure becomes strong enough? Those thoughts stayed with me. But then came the other side. If I refused, the consequences would not be theoretical. They would be real. There could be violence, confusion, division, fear. Men who once stood together could turn against each other, and innocent people could be caught in the middle of something they did not choose. This was not a simple matter of courage. It was a matter of responsibility. I carried not only my own life, but the lives of millions who depend on decisions they will never witness directly. That is the burden of leadership, and in that moment it felt heavier than ever. The next day, we gathered again. The emergency meeting was focused, disciplined, and honest. No one pretended that the situation was manageable in a simple way. The four main paths were placed before us: to give in and comply, to strike first and attempt to disrupt the threat, to open a channel for negotiation, or to remain neutral and delay any clear response. Each option had its reasoning, each option had its risks, and each option in some way made sense. I listened carefully. I asked questions. I allowed every voice to be heard, because when the stakes are this high, silence from others can be dangerous. But as the discussion continued, I felt something becoming clearer inside me. None of these options addressed the true nature of what we were facing. They were all responses to a political threat. But what stood before us was not only political. It was something that reached beyond strategy, beyond tactics, beyond timing. It touched the soul. And I realized that if I chose any of those paths without first answering a deeper question, I would be acting without clarity. So I did something that surprised some in the room. I rejected all four options, not because they were wrong, but because they were incomplete. There was a silence after I said it. Not the silence of confusion, but the silence of realization. Because once something like that is spoken, everyone understands that the situation is no longer being approached in the usual way. I told them that this was not just a crisis of governance. It was a test of what cannot be negotiated. A line that, once crossed, changes everything. And I knew that before we could decide what to do, I had to decide who I was. That is not a question leaders often speak about openly, but it is one that defines every decision they make. Am I a man who protects position at all costs? Or am I a man who stands for something that cannot be bought, cannot be threatened, and cannot be taken? That question stayed with me long after the meeting ended. Because the truth is, no plan, no strategy, no alliance can answer that for you. It is a decision made in the quiet, in the unseen, in the place where there is no applause and no audience, only truth. I did not arrive at that answer quickly. I did not rush to a conclusion, because I understood that once I stepped forward, there would be no turning back. But as the hours passed, something inside me became steady, not louder, not dramatic, just clear. I began to understand that fear has a voice. It speaks of consequences, of loss, of risk, and it speaks convincingly. But faith also has a voice, and it does not shout. It does not rush. It simply remains. And in that stillness, it reminds you of what cannot be taken unless you give it away. That was the battle I was facing. Not between two external forces, but between two internal voices. One asking me to preserve what can be seen, the other asking me to remain faithful to what cannot. And in the end, I knew that whichever voice I followed would define everything that came after. By the time the 5th day of March arrived, I already knew what I would do. Not because the situation had improved, it had not. The threat remained exactly as it was. The forces behind it had not withdrawn. The internal risks had not disappeared. Nothing around me had changed, but something within me had become settled. And when that happens, the decision is no longer heavy. It becomes clear. The date was set. The time was fixed. The national broadcast had been arranged. It would be the evening, prime hour, the moment when the largest number of people would be watching. Not only in Burkina Faso, but across the continent. This was not accidental. They wanted a stage. And I understood that if I stepped onto that stage, I would not just be speaking to my people. I would be speaking into a moment that many would remember. As the hour approached, the atmosphere around me was controlled, but tense. Security was at its highest level. Communications were being monitored. Every movement was calculated. But inside I was calm. Not because I did not understand the danger, but because the decision had already been made. There is a kind of peace that does not come from safety, but from certainty. And I felt that peace. I remember walking toward the place where the broadcast would begin. Each step felt steady, not rushed, not hesitant, simply forward. Because once a man knows what he will not betray, the path in front of him becomes straight. When I stood before the cameras, I did not see them as instruments of pressure. I saw them as witnesses. Witnesses to a moment where a line would either be crossed or held. I did not prepare a long speech. I did not use complicated words, because truth does not require decoration. It requires clarity. I looked forward, knowing that what I was about to say would carry consequences I could not control. And I spoke. I said that I would never deny Jesus Christ. I said that my faith could not be bought. It could not be threatened. And it could not be destroyed. I said that even if the cost was my position, my safety, or my life, my faith would remain. There was no anger in my voice. No defiance for the sake of appearance. Only conviction. Because this was not a performance. It was a declaration. And when the words were spoken, something happened that cannot be easily explained. The room became completely still. Not the kind of silence that comes from uncertainty, but the kind that follows truth. No one moved. No one interrupted. Because in that moment, everyone present understood that something irreversible had just taken place. A line had been drawn, not in politics, but in principle. And once that line exists, it changes how everything else is seen. I knew as I finished speaking that the next hours could bring anything. There could be immediate reaction. There could be retaliation. There could be confusion. But I also knew something else. I had not given away what they came to take. And that mattered more than anything that could follow. When I stepped away from that position, I did not feel relief. Relief is what comes when danger passes. And danger had not passed. What I felt was something different. A quiet strength. The kind that comes when you know you have stood where you needed to stand. and that no matter what happens next, you did not compromise what defines you. There are moments in a person's life that divide everything into before and after. This was one of those moments. Before that night, I was a man carrying a question. After that night, I was a man who had given an answer, and that answer would now move forward into the world, beyond my control, beyond my reach, but fully aligned with what I believe. Because in the end, leadership is not proven in comfort. It is revealed in moments like this, when the cost is clear and the choice is still made. After that night, many people began to speak about courage. Some called it strength. Some called it conviction. Some said it was a bold act of leadership. I understand why they would say that. But what I experienced did not feel like strength in the way people often imagine it. It felt like clarity, because true leadership is not built in moments of applause. It is revealed in moments where something must not be betrayed. In the days that followed, I had time to reflect. Not on the reaction of the world, not on the discussions that began to spread, but on something more personal. What does it truly mean to lead? For many, leadership is defined by power, the ability to make decisions, to command, to influence outcomes, to shape events. And those things are part of it, but they are not the foundation. Because power can be taken, position can be lost, authority can shift. If leadership is built only on those things, then it stands on ground that can move. What I came to understand more deeply is this: leadership is not first about what you control. It is about what you refuse to surrender. There are lines in life that define a person, lines that are not always visible to others but are always present within. And when those lines are tested, a decision must be made. Do you hold them or do you move them? If a man moves those lines once, he may find reasons to move them again and again, until eventually there is nothing left that cannot be negotiated. Nothing left that stands firm. That is when leadership begins to fade. Not because of external pressure, but because of internal compromise. I realized that night that my role was not only to protect a nation, it was also to stand in a place where certain things remain unchanged. Not because it is easy, but because without those fixed points, everything else becomes uncertain. A leader may lose position. He may lose support. He may lose comfort. But if he loses what he believes at his core, he loses something far greater. He loses himself. And once that is gone, no title can restore it. I thought about the generations watching, not just in my country, but beyond. People who may never meet me, who may never know the details of this moment, but who will hear something about it. What would they take from it? Would they see a man who held his ground when it mattered? Or a man who adjusted when the pressure became strong? Because those examples shape more than opinion. They shape expectation. They influence what others believe is possible, and what they believe is acceptable. That is why leadership carries such weight. Not because of the power it holds, but because of the example it sets. I do not claim perfection. I do not claim that every decision I make is without flaw. But I understood in that moment that there are certain decisions that define everything else. Decisions that do not require complexity, only honesty. And honesty, when it is real, is often simple. You either stand or you do not. There is no middle ground in those moments. No partial answer. No safe compromise. Only a clear line and a clear choice. I also came to see that leadership is not about being fearless. It is about not allowing fear to decide for you. Because fear will always present reasons. It will always speak in a voice that sounds reasonable. It will tell you what you might lose, what might happen, what could go wrong. And all of those things may be true. But leadership requires something beyond listening to those voices. It requires knowing which voice you will follow. The one that protects you for a moment, or the one that defines you for a lifetime. That is the difference. And that is what I learned more clearly than ever before. That night did not make me a different man, but it revealed what kind of man I had to be. Because in the end, leadership is not proven by what you gain. It is proven by what you are willing to lose in order to remain true. After I spoke on that night, many believed the moment had passed. They thought the decision had been made, the line had been drawn, and now everything would simply unfold according to what had already been set in motion. But I understood something different. What I said that evening was not the end of the matter. It was the beginning of something that needed to be made even clearer. Because a single statement, no matter how firm, can be interpreted in many ways. Some may see it as emotion, others as resistance, others as a political gesture. But what I carried inside me was not any of those things. It was conviction. and conviction must be expressed in a way that cannot be misunderstood. So, in the hours that followed, I knew there was something more that needed to be done. Not louder, not more dramatic, but more precise. A declaration not directed at any group or any opponent, but directed at a truth that stands on its own. I wanted it to be clear that this was not a conflict between one belief and another. It was not a contest of ideologies. It was not even a matter of defending a position. It was about something more fundamental, the freedom of the human soul. I spoke again, this time not under pressure, not under a deadline, but from a place of clarity. I said that no one has the authority to force belief. No power, no system, no threat can reach into the inner life of a person and dictate what must be held there. Because belief is not an object. It is not something that can be transferred, controlled, or negotiated. It is something that lives within a person, and only that person can choose it. I made it clear that faith in Jesus Christ is not a political tool. It is not a strategy. It is not something that can be used for advantage or set aside for convenience. It is life. It is truth. And it is not subject to the commands of any authority. These were not words spoken to challenge. They were words spoken to establish a boundary that should never be crossed. Because once a line is crossed where belief becomes something that can be forced or forbidden, the consequences go far beyond one individual. They reach into every home, every community, every future decision that will be made under the weight of fear. I wanted people to understand that what had happened was not simply a moment of resistance. It was a moment of clarity. A reminder that there are things in this world that do not belong to governments, to groups, or to those who seek control. They belong to the individual. And among those things, faith stands at the highest level. I also understood that such a declaration carries risk. Because when you say that something cannot be controlled, those who seek control will not accept it easily. But silence would have carried a greater risk. Because silence can be interpreted as uncertainty, and uncertainty can be used to create pressure. So, I chose to speak clearly, not in anger, not in defiance, but in truth. I said that faith in Jesus Christ is not something that can be erased by threat. It is not something that can be reduced by fear, and it is not something that can be taken away by force. It either lives within a person, or it does not. And when it does, it remains. That was the declaration. Simple, direct, without decoration, because truth does not need to be complex to be understood. It only needs to be spoken without compromise. And once it is spoken that way, it stands. Not because of who said it, but because of what it is. I knew that those words would travel, that they would be heard in places I would never see, that they would be discussed, questioned, and perhaps even challenged. But that was not my concern. My responsibility was not to control how the words would be received. It was to ensure that they were true. And once that was done, the rest would follow its own path. Because when something is grounded in truth, it does not depend on agreement to exist. It simply remains. After the declaration was made, the waiting began. Not the kind of waiting that is calm or passive, but the kind that carries weight in every hour. Because when a line has been drawn, what follows is often uncertain. We moved immediately into a state of readiness. Not out of panic, but out of responsibility. The security forces were placed on high alert. Communications were tightened. Every known point of risk was reviewed again, not once, but repeatedly. There was no room for assumption. Because the threat we faced was not symbolic, it was real, and it had already shown its intent. Those first hours passed slowly. Time, in such moments, does not move in the way it usually does. Each minute feels longer. Each update carries more significance. Every piece of information is examined carefully. And still, beneath all of that activity, there is a quiet question that remains. What will happen next? I will speak honestly. There were moments when the weight of responsibility pressed heavily, because I knew that what had been set in motion might not be easily stopped. There were forces already prepared, plans already in place, people already committed. And when such things reach a certain point, they do not always turn back. But something began to happen. Not all at once, not in a dramatic way, but steadily. The first reports came in. Information that certain individuals within the system had been identified. Not suspected, confirmed, men who had chosen to align themselves with what was being prepared. They were not many, but they were enough to create danger, and they had been positioned carefully. That is often how such actions begin. Not with large numbers, but with precise placement. As those individuals were located, action was taken. Quietly, decisively. There was no need for public display, no need for noise, because the goal was not to create fear, it was to remove it. More information followed. A second attempt, connected but separate, had also been uncovered. Different individuals, different approach, same objective. And again, it was stopped. Not by chance, but by vigilance, by preparation, and perhaps by something more. By the time the first full cycle of 48 hours had passed, it became clear the outcome they had prepared did not take place. There was no coup. There was no sudden collapse. There was no takeover of power. What had been presented as certain did not happen. And in that moment, I understood something that cannot always be measured. Fear had been present. It had spoken loudly. It had presented its case with clarity. It had shown all the possible losses, all the risks, all the consequences, but it had not prevailed. And the reason was not that fear was weak. It was that something stronger had stood in its place. Faith, not as a concept, not as a word, but as something lived, something held, something not surrendered. I do not say this to present myself as fearless. That would not be true. Fear was there. It was real, but it did not decide. That is the difference. Because courage is not the absence of fear. It is the refusal to let fear become the final voice. And in those hours, that refusal mattered. Not only for me, but for everyone who was watching, whether they realized it or not. Because when people see that fear does not always win, something changes. A possibility appears. A different outcome becomes imaginable. And that is powerful. What followed was not celebration. There was no sense of victory in the way people often describe it. Because we knew that challenges do not end in a single moment. But there was clarity, a recognition that what had been threatened as inevitable had been prevented, and more importantly, that the decision made at the beginning had not led to destruction. It had led through it. That is something I will not forget, because it showed me that the outcomes we fear most are not always as certain as they appear, and that standing firm does not always lead to collapse. Sometimes it leads to something else. Something that cannot be seen at the beginning, but becomes clear in time. And in this case, what became clear was simple. Fear had spoken, faith had answered, and the result was not what many expected. After the 48 hours passed, something else began to unfold. At first, it was quiet. A few messages, a few statements, a few reactions from those who had been following the situation closely. But then, it grew. What had started as a moment inside one country began to move beyond its borders. Voices from neighboring nations began to speak. Some expressed support, some called for stability, some simply acknowledged that something significant had taken place. Mali and Niger, countries that understand the weight of challenges in the Sahel, made their positions known. Their words were not loud, but they were clear. They had seen what happened, and they understood its meaning. From other parts of the world, the responses were different. Some called for restraint, some focused on the risks that had nearly unfolded, others chose to remain cautious, measuring their words carefully. That is the nature of international response. It often moves with calculation. But what stood out to me was not only what governments said, it was what people began to say. Across networks, across conversations, across communities, discussions began to spread. Millions of them. In a single day, the number of voices grew into the millions. People were asking questions, not about strategy, not about policy, but about something more personal. What would I have done? What would I choose? Because when a moment like this becomes visible, it no longer belongs to one person. It becomes a mirror, and everyone who sees it begins even quietly to look at themselves. Some agreed with the decision. Some questioned it. Some tried to understand it from their own perspective. And that was expected. Because truth, when it is spoken, does not always produce the same reaction in everyone, but it does produce reflection. And that reflection is important because it moves a situation from being an isolated event to becoming a shared question. I became aware that this was no longer just about Burkina Faso. It was no longer just about one threat, one decision, or one outcome. It had become something broader. A moment that asked people, regardless of where they live or what they believe, to consider something simple and yet difficult. What do you hold that cannot be taken from you? And what would you do if it were tested? These are not questions that require a public answer. They are not questions that need to be debated loudly, but they are questions that matter because they reveal something about each person, about what they value, about what they are willing to stand for, and about where their own lines are drawn. I did not seek that kind of attention. It was not the purpose. But once it happened, I understood its significance. Because in a world where many things change quickly, moments that cause people to pause and reflect are rare. And when they occur, they should not be ignored. I also understood that with attention comes interpretation. Some would see strength. Some would see risk. Some would see faith. Some would see politics. And that is natural, because people see through the lens of their own experience. But beyond all of that, there remained a simple truth. A decision had been made. A line had been held. And the outcome had not followed the path that fear had predicted. That alone was enough to create conversation, enough to cause reflection, enough to remind people that not every situation ends the way it appears at the beginning. As I observed all of this, I remained focused on what mattered, not the volume of voices, not the direction of opinion, but the fact that a question had been placed into the world, and that question would remain long after the moment itself had passed. Because the world may watch for a time, but what stays is what people carry with them after they stop watching. And in this case, what they carried was not just a story. It was a choice, one that each person in their own way would have to consider. When everything had settled, when the urgency of those days began to fade, I found myself returning to a single thought, not about what had happened, but about what had been revealed. Because there are moments in life that do not just pass, they leave something behind. A truth that becomes clearer only after the noise is gone. I understood that what I had faced was not unique in its form. Different people in different places face their own versions of such moments. Not always on a national stage, not always under public pressure, but in quiet ways, in personal decisions, in choices that no one else may ever see. And yet, those choices carry just as much weight, because they shape who a person becomes. What I came to see more deeply is this. There are battles that cannot be won with force. They cannot be solved with strategy alone. They cannot be controlled by planning, because they do not take place in the visible world. They take place within, in the space where belief, identity, and conviction exist. And in that space, the rules are different. You cannot impose victory from the outside. You can only choose it from within. That is why what was demanded of me could not truly be enforced. They could threaten my position. They could attempt to create instability. They could prepare actions against the structures around me, but they could not reach into that inner space unless I allowed it. And that is the key, because there is a difference between what can be taken and what must be given. A life can be taken. A position can be removed. Security can be lost. But faith, belief, and conviction, these cannot be taken by force. They can only be surrendered. And once I understood that fully, the situation became clearer than it had ever been. The power they appeared to hold was not complete. It depended on my response. It depended on whether I would give what they could not take. And once I refused to give it, that part of their power no longer existed. This does not mean the danger was not real. It was. It does not mean the risk disappeared. It did not. But it does mean that something essential remained untouched. And that made all the difference. I also came to understand that truth has a certain quality. It does not change based on pressure. It does not adjust based on threat. It does not weaken because it is challenged. It remains. And because it remains, it becomes something that cannot be broken. Not because it is protected by strength, but because it is not dependent on circumstances. That is what I saw in those days. Not something dramatic, not something complex, but something simple and steady. A truth that does not move. And when a person stands on something that does not move, the outcome may still be uncertain. But the foundation is not. That is what carried me through. Not confidence in what would happen, but certainty in what must not be surrendered. And that is what I hold even now. Because in the end, the greatest victories are not always visible. They are not always recognized immediately, but they are real. And they endure, because they are built on something that cannot be forced, cannot be taken, and cannot be broken. When I look back on those days now, I do not see them as a story of danger. I see them as a moment of clarity, a moment where everything that can distract a person was removed, and only one question remained. What truly matters? In a world where so many voices speak at once, it is easy to become lost in noise. Decisions are often shaped by pressure, by expectation, by the desire to preserve comfort or avoid conflict. But there are moments when all of that fades, and in those moments, a person stands alone with what they believe. Not what they say, not what they claim, but what they truly hold. That is where the real decision is made. I do not believe that what happened to me was meant only for me, because the question I faced is not limited to one place, one position, or one time. It exists everywhere, in different forms, in different situations, and it will come, sooner or later, to each person in a way that is personal. You may not be asked to stand before millions. You may not face a threat that is visible to the world, but you will face moments where something important is tested, where what you believe is placed under pressure, where you must decide quietly, without applause, without recognition. Will you hold it, or will you let it go? And no one else can answer that for you. Not a leader, not a system, not a voice from the outside. Only you. That is why this story matters. Not because of who I am, but because of what it represents. It is a reminder that there are things in life that must remain untouched, things that should not be traded, no matter the cost. Because once they are lost, they cannot be replaced. I have learned that a person can rebuild many things: a career, a position, even a reputation. But if a person loses the foundation of who they are, rebuilding becomes something much harder, because there is nothing left to build on. That is why I chose as I did. Not because it was easy, not because it was without risk, but because I understood that some losses are temporary and others are permanent. And I could not accept a permanent loss for the sake of a temporary safety. I also want to speak to those who may feel that their own choices are small, or that their own moments do not carry weight. They do. Every decision you make shapes something within you. Every time you stand firm, even in silence, something is strengthened. And every time you give in to something you know is not right, something is weakened. This is not about perfection. It is about direction. It is about choosing, again and again, what aligns with truth. Even when it is not easy. Even when it is not rewarded. Even when no one sees it. Because in the end, the most important things are not always visible. They are carried within, and they define everything else. I also want to say this clearly. The world does not need more division. It does not need more conflict built on misunderstanding. What it needs is clarity. Clarity about what is right. Clarity about what should be protected. Clarity about what should never be forced upon another human being. Faith, whatever form it takes for a person, must never become something controlled by fear. Because once fear becomes the tool, truth begins to disappear. And when truth disappears, trust follows. And when trust is gone, everything else becomes unstable. So my hope is not that people simply hear this story. My hope is that they reflect, that they take a moment to consider what they hold and what they are willing to stand for. Not in theory, but in reality, because when the moment comes, it will not ask you if you are ready. It will simply ask you to choose. And in that moment, preparation will not come from knowledge. It will come from conviction. I also hold hope for something greater, that the future will not be shaped by fear, that nations will not be guided by pressure, that individuals will not feel forced to abandon what they believe in order to survive, because a world like that is not stable. It is only quiet on the surface. True stability comes when people are free to hold what they believe without coercion, when respect exists even in difference, when strength is not measured by control but by integrity. That is the kind of world I hope to see, for Africa, for every nation, for every person. And for myself, I do not claim to have done something extraordinary. I made a choice that aligned with what I believe, and I will continue to make that choice as long as I am able, not because I am without fear, but because I know it must not be surrendered. If you have listened this far, I want to thank you, not for agreeing, not for supporting, but for taking the time to consider something that matters. And if this story has caused you to reflect even for a moment, then it has already served a purpose. If you feel it is worth sharing, then share it, not for my sake, but for the question it carries. And if you wish to hear more stories like this, then remain connected. Because there are always more moments, more lessons, and more truths waiting to be understood. And before I close, I will leave you with this, not as a statement of authority, but as a statement of truth. I am Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso, and what I have spoken to you is true. I am Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso, and these words come from truth that does not change. I'm Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso, and this is the truth I stand on.